Um, I wonder if much of who we become is shaped not only by our own gifts, but by the worlds around us that enable such of these gifts to flourish. Could it be that it is by our neighborhoods, friendships, institutions, our collaborators, and communities that we either narrow what seems possible or we open it wider? And what happens when a particular backdrop, perhaps Uptown Manhattan, Harlem, Sugar Hill, becomes that haven which allows an artistic voice to take shape? It's a question about us, about what we build, whom we let in, what we are willing to see. And could it be that when a particular place becomes that kind of haven for us, an entire artistic voice takes shape that otherwise may never have existed? Billy Strayhorn, whose wonderful music we are immersed in this morning, was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1915, and he grew up mostly in the Homewood section of Pittsburgh, in a household strained both by poverty and his father's struggles with alcoholism. He would often spend long stretches of time at his grandmother Lizzie's home in Hillsborough, North Carolina, a house with a plank porch, a piano that his grandmother played for her church, a Victrola that mostly played spirituals, and flowers that were well-loved and often the centers of conversation. When Billy Strayhorn would return from home, his sister noticed the positive impact that each time he went to North Carolina, something great had happened to him. There was this duality of a living situation that may have given the young Strayhorn something he would spend the rest of his life trying to recreate in his sound and his music. Perhaps a place where beauty did not need to justify itself immediately. And back in Pittsburgh, of course, Strayhorn led this very disciplined young adult life and seemed to remake himself with deliberate care. He studied French, he joined the French club, he kept his clothes immaculately clean, he read The New Yorker, he acquired a vocabulary so vast that even in high school he earned the nickname Dictionary. And initially, what he saw as his vocation was to be a concert pianist. He performed his own concerto for piano and percussion at his high school graduation, and he enrolled in the Pittsburgh Musical Institute. Walter van der Leur, the musicologist who has studied Strayhorn's manuscripts more closely than any other scholar, writes that despite these ambitions classically, Strayhorn ultimately turned toward jazz. And of course, one could understand that for the time period, this was a field that was more socially accessible at the time to a young black pianist and composer. His classical training did leave an unmistakable imprint on him, even so. Van der Leur traces in Strayhorn's later compositions, such as Passion Flower and Chelsea Bridge, a harmonic language indebted above all to Claude Debussy. Chords freed from the obligation to resolve, used for color, impressionist music, rather than simply harmonic direction. It was around these same Pittsburgh years also that a friend also put an Art Tatum record in his hands, the first exposure to jazz piano, and Strayhorn wore it out, according to the accounts. So as someone remembered it, Strayhorn discovered everything that he already loved in classical music was there for him in jazz too, in another form. And here was a place where he could finally, in his social milieu, put it to use. Consider that in the middle of all of this context, Strayhorn wrote his first real composition at the age of 17 years old, Lush Life, which we've just heard beautifully sung by Ava Preston. He worked at the Penfield Pharmacy in Point Breeze, a very well-to-do part of Pittsburgh, where, as his sister Lillian later put it, he was welcomed into a white world that otherwise would not have had him. Friends first heard fragments of the song in 1933 when he was 17, but it underwent a lot of revision over the next 3 years, and he really considered it finished in 1936. Despite Strayhorn not even having been to Paris at that age, as we hear in the lyrics, it imagines a sophisticated adult world of nightclubs, romance, weariness, disappointment, jadedness with extraordinary psychological assurance. The famous opening reference to gay places has understandably attracted a lot of scholarly attention. And of course, musicologist Lisa Barg notes that in the 1930s, gay ordinarily meant festive or carefree, while also beginning to circulate within queer subcultural language. She also argues that another resonance is historically plausible, but she is equally careful not to claim that the lyric proves any authorial intent, despite its complex, almost double meaning. Van der Leur, the other musicologist we've spoken about, he also hears some of young Strayhorn's complexity in the harmony itself. At the beginning of Lush Life, the music feels almost reluctant to move. The harmonic motion remains suspended, while the lyric describes movement, gaiety, and worldly experience. For just a moment, our musicians will redemonstrate the beginning of the form.
Life is lonely again, and only last year everything seems so sure.
Later, we hear the words in that strain of text, everything seems so sure. But the harmony changes at that moment. It is all the same harmony as a bed under the melody, except on the word sure, where the harmony quietly destabilizes that confidence. Perhaps it's that the young Strayhorn had an extraordinary ability to place both his uncertainty about life and his elegance in the same breath. Around the same time, a year later in 1937, Strayhorn also wrote another very important capsule of his life through lyric, the ballad Something to Live For, when Strayhorn was 21, still in Pittsburgh, still years away from anyone outside his own circle knowing his name. Author David Hajdu notes that where Lush Life speaks through fantasy, this song directly speaks from feeling. His startling request, addressed to no one in particular, for someone who might make life feel more than what it currently was. The word gay turns up here too, in the same register as it does in Lush Life, rendering plausible once more that perhaps there is a double entendre in its usage. It is then that we finally arrive to the month of December 1938, where the already established 39-year-old composer and bandleader Duke Ellington brought his orchestra to the Stanley Theater in Pittsburgh, and a friend managed to get Strayhorn backstage, where they met for the first time. Ellington had his hair done, his eyes closed, and he told Strayhorn to sit down and play something for him. Billy Strayhorn announced, "Okay, this is exactly how you played Sophisticated Lady in the show," and he played it exactly for him verbatim. Then he said, "Now, this is how I would reimagine it." And he reharmonized it into something entirely his own. He did the same with Solitude, another song from the concert. And Ellington stood, came around behind him, and he sent for other members of the orchestra to watch this spectacle before him. And what followed from that night in 1938 was a collaboration and friendship that lasted nearly 3 decades. Within months of the Stanley Theater, Strayhorn would take over stewardship of the Ellington Orchestra's vocal arrangements, firstly. In 1939, there was only one singer for whom Strayhorn wrote, but by the mid-1940s, he was supervising a whole roster of them, among them Kay Davis, Ivy Anderson, Al Hibbler, and eventually the teenager who would put her own words to Take the A-Train, a young Joya Sherrill. It was a role that surpassed being just Ellington's assistant. Strayhorn composed original works, he arranged popular songs, he arranged Ellington compositions themselves for Ellington's jazz orchestra, and he completed and developed musical ideas that Ellington had begun, discarded. Sometimes he reimagined them for smaller ensembles within the orchestra. Ellington would simply hand unfinished material to Strayhorn and say, "Finish this thing," and he would trust that he would understand both the music and the individual voices of Ellington's orchestra. It was also at this time that Strayhorn began to release some of his strongest music in his discography. In 1939, alone came 3 different pieces written within months of each other. One was, of course, Take the A Train, which we will hear later, which began nothing more as subway directions and would almost by accident become the orchestra's whole identity. Another was A Flower is a Lonesome Thing, which we will also hear later, a ballad for the wonderful saxophonist Johnny Hodges, built on a harmony so patient it can rest on a single chord for 4 bars at a time. And the third piece was Passion Flower, a close cousin in both style and mood. The list goes on and on. From there is a steady stream of important work in the 1940s and 50s, including Chelsea Bridge, Daydream, Flamingo, Upper Manhattan Medical Group, which we've heard before, and even works such as Strayhorn's rearrangement of Duke Ellington's Come Sunday in 1958. Ellington gave Strayhorn extraordinary artistic opportunities, financial stability, friendship, and access to one of the greatest musical organizations in the world. And being based in New York, Strayhorn was offered a huge opportunity, unlike he had never experienced. He lived openly with the pianist Aaron Bridgers in Sugar Hill. He moved among black artists, musicians, dancers, intellectuals, gay friends. Ralph Burns remembered gatherings where gay musicians could simply enjoy one's company without needing to explain themselves off the bat. Strayhorn belonged to the Copacetics, which was a society of black tap dancers whose first president described their standard in wonderfully simple terms, which was, what mattered was who you were, not what you were. I think there's a few things as succinct to describe of Unitarian Universalism as something like that. Who you were, not what you were. He participated in the salon also of Frank and Dorcas Neal, where artists including Tali Biati, Charles Sabri, and James Baldwin moved through the same social orbit. Dorcas Neal later recalled how important it was, especially for those who were black and gay, simply to discover that there were others like them in the arts. You heard earlier in the service a reading from David Hodge's biography, the account of a friend who called Strayhorn a triple minority, that he was black, that he was gay, and that even among gay men of his own generation, he was unusual simply for refusing to hide it. A solo career, by that account, might have brought him fame, but it perhaps would have come at the cost of concealing who he was. Contemporaries also testified that Ellington accepted Strayhorn's homosexuality at a time where, of course, this acceptance could hardly be taken for granted. Mercer Ellington later said that his father never cared Strayhorn was gay, and he backed him throughout their relationship. At the same time, Strayhorn's position within the Ellington organization could render his work publicly invisible. Many of his works, unfortunately, through the years had inconsistent attribution, contributions that went uncredited, and collaborations in which authorship became very difficult to untangle between the two of them. And Strayhorn's unusual freedom to live openly as a gay black man was intertwined with this relative public invisibility that his position beside Ellington afforded him. It could be possible that freedom and invisibility would occupy the same space. Perhaps working within Ellington's organization allowed Strayhorn to forgo that concealment of who he was, to sustain a professional life compatible with living openly. So I ask this question: are we the kind of community through whom someone may find something to live for? Can we look closely at Strayhorn's formation, and do we see an accumulation of positive community support? I would say yes. That a family provided access to an instrument, a teacher provided his instruction, community provided an audience willing to listen, a colleague opened the door backstage, and a band leader, in a span of a few minutes, recognized what he was doing and acted on it. And an organization provided employment. A circle of friends provided the kind of companionship in which his identity required no explanation. Taken together, these were the conditions under which his gifts could be exercised at all. The same structures that made this possible also at points failed him. They failed to credit his authorship. They failed to render his contribution publicly visible as it could have been. and they failed to give his name the stature his work by any reasonable measure deserved. Strayhorn's freedom remained partial, and some of it depended on this public invisibility. Perhaps this complexity is precisely why his story speaks so powerfully to our understanding of beloved community, that the complex question of Strayhorn's identity as a composer comes into definition by the smaller communities which supported him, that the world he was given may have altered what could have happened to the gifts he already possessed, and that his worth was recognized, it was protected, cultivated, and given room to flourish only through the deliberate actions of others. When Billy Strayhorn died in 1967, Take the A Train was played at his memorial as a dirge. And afterward, a small group of his closest friends walked across town. They boarded the actual A train, they rode Uptown, and they raised a glass to him. It was a piece that began as directions to Sugar Hill, and by the end of his life, it was a route back toward the people that made his life possible. We should be careful not to tell ourselves too cleanly a story. The world that received Strayhorn was not a just one. It closed the concert hall to him because he was black. And even the community that did receive him, Ellington's organization, Harlem, Sugar Hill, Uptown in general, did not always give him his name on his own work. But neither should those failures become the whole account. An imperfect community can always become something just more generous and more complete, and still be enough to make something extraordinary possible. It was enough for Billy Strayhorn to become Billy Strayhorn. So the question is whether someone in this room, or not yet through our doors, will one day be able to say that here with ourselves individually, that they were welcome, that they were seen. Billy Strayhorn found something to live for, and may we be the kind of people through whom someone else finds it too. Blessed be.